Shelagh Rogers, welcome to The Public.
Thank you, Kevin. Very glad to be here at The Public.
Well, it's such a great privilege to have you on. A lot of Canadians like myself, we are very familiar with who you are on air, but I really don't know much about your early life. So you grew up in Ottawa?
Yes, I grew up in Ottawa in a neighborhood called the Glebe. It couldn't have been more Leave It to Beaver, I suppose. You're too young to remember Leave It to Beaver, but a program about a sort of perfect family, except that we weren't a perfect family, like most families that are seen to be perfect from the outside. My parents divorced when I was in my early teens, and I think that had a very big effect on me and my siblings. I'm the oldest of four, and I was the one that was prone to depression. I think I had my first episode when I was at Queen's University, but it was diagnosed as a hormonal issue.
Right. And so you went to the campus doctor, and he said
I went to the campus doctor, and he said it's hormones, and that it would pass. Well, it did pass, but it kept coming back again, and it wasn't at all hormonal. I mean, it was but it was a diagnosis that I sort of pursued for almost 3 decades until I got the right diagnosis. But before I go too far down that road, I just want to say I recognize my very great luck growing up where I did. I still have a lot of the same friends I had when I was a kid. And if I wanted any kind of lesson, if I expressed an interest in anything, there was lessons in it. And there were many lovely things about it. But that was I think the seminal event. The divorce of my parents was very, I guess it probably affects me to this day.
Was it unexpected?
Well, yes and no. I think as you look back, you see clues. That's a great question, by the way. They seemed to be having a very good time. They went out a lot. They were invited to a lot of parties. I think this was an era of parties. We're just sort of talking about the Mad Men era, I guess. I mean,
so the 60s.
Yeah, the 60s, and my father was a stockbroker, and he would be the first to say that a lot of business was done over 2 martini lunches. And I think, my mother didn't work, but she was a very involved volunteer. She wanted to work, but my father didn't want her to work. So I think when I look back on that and I kind of see the rumblings of what became the feminist movement and women really wanting to flex their muscles and live up to their full potential, I can see now that there were difficulties and challenges and miscommunications and so on. And they both married very happily on their second marriages. But it changed things. I mean, when I think back on it now, Kevin, I was at high school when this happened, and one of the first families to be going through a divorce, one of the first kids in the school. And this would have been the early 70s.
Really? So you felt alone with it in a way that maybe we wouldn't now if that's...
I think that's true. I think this is just when people started feeling that, they wouldn't be struck by lightning if they left their marriages. And, now many of my friends' parents have gone on to find relationships that fit better or just remain single for the rest of their lives. But back then I think it was stay married at all costs.
I heard you say you came from a high-achieving family or overachieving family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, were you... I read that you were part of like Reach for the Top, and you were like the head girl at your high school. What did you feel like you had to exude a sense of, even when things weren't going well, that everything was fine?
Yes. In a nutshell, I think that's really true. And when things weren't going well, I would redouble my efforts. I wanted to succeed. I also felt that I wanted to strike out on my own, and I wanted to have whatever would help get me there, and often that is good marks.
Strike out on your own and just be the most successful person you can, or?
I doubt that I was really thinking about success back when I was 17 and I went to Queen's. I went to Queen's on the dying wish of my late grandmother.
Seems like an odd wish.
It is an odd wish, but she loved her time at Queen's University, and she told her best friend who was with her when she died that she wanted the same thing for me. And I hadn't really considered Queen's. I was thinking more of Toronto. At the time, Toronto in my head was like New York City. And growing up in Ottawa, it was the city of excitement, even though I know it was Toronto the good at the time, but there's really no such thing. I've learned that since, too. Life just seems to get more interesting and complex and kaleidoscopic as you go along. But I went to Queen's, and I felt I really didn't fit in. I was in a floor of young women who'd gone to private schools in Toronto. And even though I'd been the quote-unquote head girl or co-president of my public school, it sort of wasn't good enough. And I finally moved in. I switched roommates. I moved in with someone I'd gone to high school with, and then I got involved in the radio station. And
what just hold you there, though. So like there was a sort of palpable sense that you weren't good enough because you didn't go to private school.
Well, yeah, and because my father he wasn't a doctor or an architect or an engineer or a lawyer. He was a stockbroker. There was more than a palpable sense. I actually heard it. And
from others saying like, oh, she's from just a working class family.
Background. That's right. I mean, not working class, but middle class.
Yeah.
And it was, I did not fit in. It was, I had a very strong feeling of one of these things is not like the other, and that one thing was me. And that was fine. I ran for the role of vice president of my year at Queen's, and I got it. But even then, everyone else around me had been to private schools in Toronto, and it just wasn't very comfortable. But we did good things, like we fought against a parking lot being built on the campus.
Really? So you were, was this the AMS you were a part of?
It was ASUS, the Arts
okay.
Society. And boy, you've done your research.
No, I went to Queen's myself.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I happened to meet Paul Kennedy at that point as well, which is, we've had a long friendship. But yeah, it was the radio station that really kind of, I felt comfortable there. I think there were a lot of people who felt that they were either on the margins or just kind of, the kids that didn't really fit in. And we fit in with each other. And so we were kind of anonymous people with on-air personalities and trying this great experiment in radio.
What year did you get involved with the station?
I think it was 1973. Fall of 1973.
So, I mean, what year in university?
Oh, in university, it was my first year.
Okay. So it was right away, like you got that community.
Not right. It would have been in the second term, but yeah.
Right. But for that first term, you felt pretty alienated?
I felt like I was floating. And yeah, alienated is a good way to put it, I think.
Because that's a scary time. You lose all your friends, basically. You are in a brand new place, in a brand new community. And if you don't have those connections, that can be lonely. Yeah,
I think it was lonely. I know the image. I'm aware that the image that I project to the world is one of extroversion, and I don't really see myself that way. But I try to get past it. I try to get past being an introvert by supporting causes that I believe in and getting involved, if I can, at a kind of socio-political level, if you will. And I also noticed that no one else seemed to be running for these positions. And I think if you really want to create change or make sure things happen or don't happen, that you have to get involved. And I think that was something that was really instilled in me by my mother. And my father has a history of women in politics. His grandmother was the first female member of the Manitoba legislature, and her daughter was the first Manitoba federal MP who was a woman. And so I guess there's always been kind of political talk around our table.
So did you had a strong political sense then growing up?
I think I did. I think I remember when I ran for head girl, I wasn't running on sort of how many dances we'd have every month. It was about it was about some kind of change. It was we were on the verge of a teacher's strike, which actually did happen. And I remember helping to organize parents to come and support extracurricular activities. And I just sort of saw a hole that could be filled in, I guess. And I was very good friends with someone I'm still a good friend with, Victoria Freeman, who's an author and also teaches First Nations governance in Toronto. And she was the editor of the yearbook. So she was my dearest friend. She went to U of T. I would have gone there probably in a very large way to be with her. But then there was the dying wish of my late grandmother. So it was a very interesting time, but I felt my sense of loneliness vanish when I got involved in the radio station. And I think partly it was the camaraderie of the people there who, in their own ways, were probably social misfits. I don't like the word misfit very much, but I like it when you say misfit in a different expression. We just didn't really fit in with other people or what was going on campus. And we also had our audiences. We had that relationship. And that undefinable connection is something that has pulled me through a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't use it as medicine, but it is medicine, I guess, because it's connection. And I've never thought of it that way, by the way. So there you go.
The connection with your audience.
Beg your pardon?
You mean the connection you get from your audience? You feel part of a community by doing it.
There's something about it. I've always seen it as one-on-one, and when I worked with Peter Gzowski, he told me that he never addressed, and this was very true, it's borne out by every interview I've ever heard him do, but you never address your listener as everyone or everybody or the second person plural. It's always the second person singular. And that is already a form of intimacy.
Mm-hmm. And radio has that.
And radio does have that ability. I think TV has it less so, but radio certainly does.
I read an interesting story about how you came to walk into CFRC the first time. You were listening to the radio on a Sunday afternoon?
Yes.
And so what happened?
Well, boy, I mean, this is, we're really having to dust off some brain cells here, but I recall that I was listening to somebody who was reading record notes off a classical music record jacket, and I thought...
Just straight off?
Straight off, and I thought you should have to do more than this if you're going to be on the radio. You should have to give it some kind of, well, we weren't talking about spin then, but at least do something that was original. And I talked about this with my roommate, and she finally said, well, if you think you can do better, why don't you go down there then? Just trying to get me to shut up. And I did. So I guess it was that particular spur that got me through the door. And I had an interest in classical music. I played violin in the Ottawa Youth Orchestra and a few other places, and within 3 weeks, I was the classical music director.
I want to go back to a bit about just your general life at the time. I read, so you were involved in a serious car crash when you were 17?
Yeah. I was out with my dear friend Victoria, and we were with two former teachers. We were just home on a Christmas break at university, and I went through a windshield. You went through a windshield? I went through a windshield. I don't remember this, but I am told that's what happened. And my face was full of glass, and I remember coming to a couple of hours later in the Ottawa General Hospital, and a nurse telling me that she thought it was miraculous that I could still see and that my lips weren't too badly messed up. My upper lip was a bit split and required a bit of stitching up. But for years after that, I had glass coming out of my forehead. And I do have a scar on my forehead to this day. And you mean like tiny little pieces? Tiny little shards of glass, yep. Yeah. And your skin will just work it out the way they work out a splinter or something. But yeah, it hasn't happened for a long time. But for many years it was happening, and I could just pull out a shard almost, and identify it as such. But yeah, it was a big event.
Did it humble you? Did it scare you?
I think it messed me up quite a bit, quite honestly. I've never thought about whether it humbled me or not, but
did it give you like a sense of mortality, or?
Absolutely, yes. And I do think, as I look back on it now, you have this feeling of just being so bloody lucky. It could have been a lot worse. And I felt when I came to, I remember this feeling of just such incredible peace. I think now, as I look back on it, I was in shock, but I felt a real sense of peace. And soon after that, I went back to school. I looked like Quasimodo. My head was purple, half of it was shaved, half of my hair was shaved off. And I wore great big Jackie O sunglasses because, really from the nose up, I was very, very badly bruised. And
was that tough?
I guess I didn't really, you don't think about these things as you're looking out onto the world. It was only when I looked in the mirror that it was really kind of shocking. But I also found it interesting. And
in what way?
Well, I didn't look like myself, but I was myself. And it gave me, I think, a very interesting point of view or a perspective of just, it's who you are, not what you look like. And I guess fairly soon after that, it was a couple of months, surely the bruising had gone away, but I had hair that was sort of growing straight up on the top of my head, and the rest of my hair was quite long. I was on an art history trip, and I got separated from the rest of my group, and I was separated with this other guy. We got into a big argument about a piece of art. But a couple of months after that, he was my first serious boyfriend, and he seemed to be able to see beyond the scar on my forehead and so on, and it didn't matter. And I think that was a real lesson.
That appearances don't always tell the story.
Yeah, in fact, very seldom do.
This was also, like you said, you felt spiritual after. I read you became a born-again Christian, or you became more religious?
I did. I was raised in a home that was Anglican. And I have to say, the thing I liked best about the church while I was growing up was the music. But I didn't really get all the other stuff, the transformation of the communion and so on, of the sacraments. But when I got back to Queens, I went to register for a part-time course, and at the end of the sort of twisty road that you had to go through to register in the arena, there was a woman with a clipboard, and she said to me, do you believe Jesus Christ is your personal Savior? And I think just as I'm doing with you now, I kind of met the question head on and thought, yeah, I guess I do. Everyone kept telling me things could have been a lot worse in this car accident, and this would have been probably 10 days after the accident. And I said, yeah, I do. And I got involved in a group called the Navigators.
And what was the group?
Well, they were a group from the South originally, and it was an evangelical group. We had prayer meetings. We had regular church sessions. Part of what we were supposed to do was to proselytize, and I remember going into the buildings where the engineers lived on campus, knocking on their door and actually asking them, how was your walk with Jesus Christ? And
what every first-year university student wants to hear.
Exactly, and having a lot of doors slammed in my face. But sometimes they didn't, and I really felt I had been saved at that point. And as I look back on it now, I did, I was with the Navigators for about 5 years until I moved in with a friend who was going through a divorce. And my little Bible study group had really urged me to try to get her back with her husband. And I knew it wasn't a violent relationship or anything like that, but they'd both outgrown an early marriage, and I didn't feel that it was my role to get them back to their vows.
Right.
And so we had a falling out. And after that, I've really been, I think, searching ever since.
So that was like a clear break. Like did you stop in a sense being a Christian at that point? Or did you just not believe in the organized part?
I didn't believe in the organized part, and I think now that I'm involved in looking at what was done in the name of the church in the history of Canada through the residential school program, I'm still wrestling with it. I think I walk around with my own private relationship with a creature greater than I am. I think I can say that firmly. But I'm really in the process of puzzling this out.
Well, back to radio. So you work at is it CKWS in Kingston?
Well, I worked there for a number of years, and I had a bunch of different shows on the radio. I also ended up hosting a television program. I think the reason...
Really, like a local Kingston...
A local Kingston TV program called Talk of the Town. And I'm pretty sure I got that job because I was the person who would accept the very low salary. But I hosted, researched, and produced a half-hour daily TV program.
Wow. That's a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
And did you like television?
Do I like television? I really hate watching myself on TV. I guess I'm pretty critical of how I look, what I weigh, what I'm wearing. But I hate all the stuff that you have to think about. I like radio for many, many reasons. The intimacy, the reaching into someone's mind, people being able to create their own image of something. And last but certainly not least, what you don't have to wear.
So when did you get a strong sense like broadcasting is what I want to do? Was it as soon as you started volunteering at the radio station, or did it come over time?
That's a great question. I really wanted to be the person that worked on the restoration of the Sistine Chapel. I loved art history. I had read The Agony and the Ecstasy when I was a teenager about Michelangelo, and I just thought, wow, that would be great. And I was taking Italian courses and Italian Renaissance art courses, and I knew that if I really wanted to be an art conservator, I'd also have to take some chemistry and so on. And that was in my plan, in my head. But radio absolutely did intervene, and it did grab me by the heart. It really did. I loved it. I felt at home. I didn't ever feel it was easy, and I still don't feel it's easy, but it is satisfying. And you know when you're really connecting with somebody, as a host talking to someone, or as a host broadcasting to a listener, it's a really great, it's a very great and powerful feeling. Mm-hmm. And I love the idea of connecting Canada through conversation. I think, my turf, when I haven't been doing music programs, and I have spent some time on what is now called Radio 2, but my turf has always been Canada, and I've been very lucky. And I love it.
I mean, so you started in Ottawa in 1980, was it?
Yes, that's right.
And so you're there for a few years, and then you come to Toronto. And is that when you first meet Peter Gzowski? Or maybe you can just tell me about the first time you met Peter Gzowski, because that was an important marker in your career. It's
an enormous marker. I can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't met him. He used to say that when I interviewed him about his first golf tournament for literacy, that was not the first time we had met. But it's the first time I remember meeting him. And I'm certain I would have remembered, but he said we'd met at somebody's book launch. Anyway, I wasn't going to argue with him. The meeting that mattered to me, as I look back, was him coming to be interviewed on Metro Morning, which I was hosting at the time, and to talk about his first golf tournament for literacy. And I was very, very, very nervous about interviewing the great interviewer. I've said in the past that it was like Oz coming to Dorothy, and I still really have that feeling.
So you had looked up to him for a while? You had listened to
yes,
Morningside?
I remember him well from the 1970s in This Country in the Morning. I remember my mother listening to him and really, just thinking this program was incredible, and it was. And I remember hearing it. I didn't really listen to it in a very focused way. I was in high school, so I really only heard it when I wasn't in school. But it always sounded like there was some kind of party going on, or there was something going on around a dining room table. And it had a really different sound from all the other programs that were on at the time. But then when Peter came back, he came back in 1980 to Morningside.
This is after he left for television?
This was after he left for television, and
which didn't work out.
Which didn't work out. I think Peter always wanted to conquer TV, and I don't know that he ever did. Anyway, Morningside had its own sound as well, and it had heft, it had lightheartedness, it had compassion, it had challenge, it had the country, it had Canada, and it was connecting Canada to its parts, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, could you maybe just give us a sense, for people who didn't grow up hearing Morningside, this was a really iconic and important show for Canada.
It absolutely was, and I mean, people would talk about it as sort of a national coffee shop, if you will, or when people talked about the letters on Morningside, which Peter felt were really important, and I do too.
And that's what you started. That's what you started working on Morningside for.
Yeah, he invited me to read the letters, the listener mail with him. He felt that was kind of like a national bulletin board, and people wrote in to suggest topics all the time from where they lived, and it was iconic. There was a panel every Tuesday morning. Dalton Camp, Eric Kierans, and Stephen Lewis, that was unmissable. There was a lot of unmissable radio on Morningside, and I remember being interviewed very early on, like in 1981, probably by the station manager at CBO in Ottawa. What are your goals? Where do you see yourself in 20 years? And I said, because I had to say something, I wasn't thinking that way. But I said, gee, I'd really like to be working with Peter Gzowski. Well, 5 years later, I was. And I think it was just by virtue of the fact that I did not revere Peter Gzowski when he came in to be interviewed. I worked hard at not showing him that I was blown away by him or that I was nervous. I was actually kind of saucy with him, kind of cheeky in that interview. And he liked that. He liked the fact that it wasn't reverential, and I think he recognized that even in the interview that we had on Metro Morning, we had a rapport. And I was still just knocked out when I got the call a couple of weeks later saying, want to come and read the mail on Morningside.
So this was the same interview you're talking about literacy.
Yeah,
and so you blew him away with that interview, and
I don't know if I blew him away, but something happened.
He was impressed, or something happened.
I mean, maybe he just felt I was a good fit. I never asked him. I wish I had, but.
And were you nervous?
Oh yeah, I was petrified. Peter was everything I revered about CBC radio. He, in many ways, in my head, he was CBC radio to me. And Morningside, as you say, it was at that point an iconic program. And I think everybody wanted to work on Morningside somehow. If you got to work on Morningside, you were working on the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth. It was the program, and it was influential. It helped to change things. I think when they had social policy discussions, people became aware of stuff. Politicians wanted to be on Morningside and not to spin the way things happen now. It was, I think people really felt they were talking to Peter, and Peter was always respectful, but he certainly would go after people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, it was. I was terrified talking to him, but I probably went overboard trying to cover that up by being playful or by being even kind of saucy.
Were you friends? I mean, I've read that, he seemed very warm on the air, and that's why the show resonated with so many Canadians. But it sounds like off the air, he could be quite short, and he wasn't the easiest person to get to know. Did you feel like you were able to break through that somehow?
I don't think I even had to try. He was my friend, and he was my mentor too, no question.
And why do you think you were able to connect when to so many other people he didn't seem to, he rubbed them the wrong way?
I think I understood why he was the way he was. I think this is a man who hosted this program for 15 years, who never had a good night's sleep. So he was incredibly sleep deprived. He was prone to depression. I know what it's like to do that shift, and believe me, it changes your personality. It's
waking up that early. I mean, you're waking up in the middle of the night, for God's sake. He often said he liked the symmetry of 3:13, and that's when his alarm went off. And mine, when I was doing that shift, went off at 3:33. And I think, I might have been able to break through your words because I don't think I was a threat to him. You weren't trying to take over his job, you mean?
I wasn't trying to take over his job. I really, it wasn't until he left and I realized that there wasn't the possibility of us working together again. Because at one point he wanted to propose a Morningside where I did the first 4 days, but he would come in on Fridays and do the things that he really loved doing, like the political panel or interviewing the authors he wanted to talk to. And but that didn't fly. By the end of it, though, I have to say Peter recognized that it needed to change. It needed to become more reflective of Canada and in the way Canada that was changing at the time, i.e. becoming more urban, more diverse, and younger.
Right.
And so Peter recognized that was something that would have to change if Morningside were to evolve. And Morningside did changed. I mean, the morning slot changed into this morning. And it took me a long time to figure that out, but I really respect that decision.
By the CBC management?
By CBC management, yeah.
So he retires in 1997, and you for long stretches, you actually hosted the show.
Yes.
But you were sort of passed over, sort of, at this point.
Well, I don't know if I'd describe it that way. I was just urged not to audition. If that's passed over, maybe I was passed over. But
did you feel hurt?
Also very, very over that.
But at the time, did you feel hurt by that?
All of this was so very public. I wish that it could have been all done behind closed doors. But I guess I was invited to come back to Radio 2. And in fact, they were just creating Radio 2, and there was this program that was 5 hours long that had my name on it. And part of me really felt this program's designed to kill me, because 5 hours is a long shift, no matter what you're doing. It's a lot of stamina and a lot of attention to really being present. And I determined that I would make it the highest rated show in that time slot on CBC Stereo ever. And with my producer, Mark Steinmetz, I did. And would I like to have been hosting right after Peter? I think At the time, yes. But I know what it's like to come after an icon, because around that time, Elwy Yost left Saturday Night at the Movies. And I was urged to apply, and I did apply, and I got it. And it was very, very hard coming right after the giant. Mm-hmm. Very, very hard. And so I think I learned a very important lesson then. And then in 2000, Michael announced that he was leaving. I threw my hat into the ring again. It happened to be around the same time as I was offered a very, very good position at National Public Radio in the United States.
Really?
And, yeah.
For what program, or for what position?
It was it would be to host the National Arts program, and I can't even remember what it was called now. It had performance in the title. But I had told them I really wanted to do current affairs interviews, and they said, well, I think we could probably manage one of the weekend programs of All Things Considered. And this was enormous. And this was just enormous. But
that's a very big show.
It's a big show, and the performance program was very big as well. I mean, you're talking about the American art scene. It was phenomenal. And I didn't want to leave Canada. I really, when it came right down to it, I really did not want to leave my country. And so I did throw my hat into the ring and applied for the position of host of This Morning. And I went through an audition, and there were 5 of us. I don't know who they all were, but we were all focus grouped. And the focus group picked me. So there I was for 2 years hosting This Morning. And that was a lot of fun. And then, you know how the schedule has changed. It went, the morning was divided. I ended up with the second half of the morning, Sounds Like Canada. And then, 5 years ago, I started hosting The Next Chapter.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, this was when you take over Sounds Like Canada, this was a time that was pretty hard in your life. You were suffering from high blood pressure, and later on revealed that you were also suffering from depression, or battling depression.
Right.
Can you take us back? Like, what was... You fainted one day in the studio, and you didn't even realize you were facing depression.
Yeah. I had a bit of an inkling, because a few weeks prior to that, I'd interviewed Ron Ellis, the former Toronto Maple Leaf, and he'd written a book called Over the Boards, where he talked about his career, but he also talked about his depression. And I told him when the interview ended and we were off the tape, that I really recognized in his story something in the life of a friend of mine. I have a friend.
You couldn't say it yourself. Yeah.
I didn't say it myself, no. And I think he clued in, and he said, well, you should tell your friend to get some help and go and see a professional, go and see your family doctor, and your family doctor will get you to some get your friend to some psychiatric help. And I guess I stored that in the back of my mind. But the episode in my office when I passed out, I was out for about 15 minutes, and I felt weird inside. I mean, not just because I'd seen stars and so on, but I didn't feel right. I went to a Shoppers Drug Mart. My blood pressure was really high. I phoned my doctor. I was very lucky to have a doctor I could phone. Not many Canadians have that privilege, and I did. And she got me into her office right away and took my blood pressure. It wasn't much lower, but she said to me, you're not going back to work until your blood pressure is normal. And
this was really hard on you, it sounds. You said you didn't know who you were without work.
That's right, yeah. I really didn't. I really defined myself through my work. As my husband could tell you, I found the summers that I was off long and hard. So I worked during the summer. I would host writers' festivals and music festivals and host debates, whatever I could do just to stay working.
And do you, like, in retrospect, do you think you were just working so hard to sort of not feel empty, or to
Absolutely.
face the emptiness?
Yes, Dr. Canners. Absolutely. I absolutely was. I don't know if you know about this or if that's just an excellent question, but I was fighting. Yeah, I was trying to fill the vessel all the time. And it wasn't really holding. It was like there was a hole at the bottom of the bucket that was me. And I realized once I got off the sort of assembly line of work, where I had this kind of smorgasbord of really interesting people to talk to every morning. I was being fed all the time, and once I stopped being fed, I felt I didn't have a purpose. I did feel extremely empty. I felt more than that. I guess I began to fill up with a very big sense of self-loathing, which I felt many times through my life, and it has stopped me for weeks and weeks at a time. I didn't know what it was, and I think coming from the family I come from, I felt I was being indulgent, and I should just get up off my ass and get busy again.
Right. It's a failing. It's
exactly, that's a moral failing. And when I had this diagnosis, I mean, I was, for a few days, I just thought, oh man, I mean, it was unipolar depression. But I felt that the day I was diagnosed was almost like a birthday. I could do something about it. I knew what it was. I could go after this. I could educate myself. I could get the right treatment.
I mean, I read that you couldn't even speak for a while. Like you lost your...
I lost the ability to speak, and
what did it look like? Like, were you just shut in inside of your house? Like were you didn't even go outside?
I didn't go outside. I didn't go outside for weeks and weeks. And if you really want to go there, I'll go there. Okay. I didn't shower. I didn't brush my teeth. I lost all sense of personal care. I couldn't get out of bed.
You just couldn't face the world. You were literally just lying in bed all day.
Yeah.
Facing self-tormenting thoughts.
Or just nothing. Just nothing. But self-tormenting, absolutely. That when I was more sort of awake, but I stared at a ceiling for months, really.
And then it's this downward cycle where you feel bad about feeling bad.
Yeah, and knowing also in another corner of my mind that I was costing the CBC money, that they had to have a fill-in host for me. I was working probably on a number of other things too, that giving talks and promising to host stuff outside and having to let down a whole bunch of people. I have a really good friend who, long before I was diagnosed, would talk about Sheila doing a disappearing act. And I did disappear over the decades until I was diagnosed. And then when I was diagnosed, at least I knew why I was doing this. I knew what it was. And gradually, I mean, I got treatment, and I was helped enormously by medication. It lifted the anvil off of me. But what really worked for me was talking to somebody, was seeing a psychologist.
And was part of the problem in facing it the fact that you on the air have always seemed so cheerful and warm and happy? Was to a lot of people it just wouldn't fit at all. Was that part of the problem, admitting it to yourself?
Oh, I really get that. I mean, I hear myself in old recordings and I think, my God, I can tell when I'm faking upbeat or faking happiness, and sometimes I went way overboard to the point of just perky, which I'm not a perky person. I think when I'm feeling good, I feel positive and I have a lot of energy. I'm sure that's true for most people. But I was not that person. That was a performance. I remember talking to Oliver Shore about this, the late, great fiddler, who suffered from depression as well. But he would tell me that as soon as he picked up his violin, he was performing, and he went somewhere else in his head. And I think when I was at the microphone, it was as though I put on a jacket and I could do this job. I knew what to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I know now, when I listen back to some mornings where I just feel, there are recordings where I just know I really should have been off. Mm-hmm. I should have been off stage and not working so hard to prove that I had to be there. And, I didn't want to miss stuff.
Yeah.
I remember once being off, and I missed interviewing Julia Child. I mean, there are people that I might have missed. I've missed one conversation with Jean Vanier. Life's too short to miss a conversation with Jean Vanier, as you know. Mm-hmm. I've been very fortunate to talk to him a number of times in my life, and he puts it in a very beautiful way, I think. It's about acknowledging our brokenness. And I think we're all broken. I met him back at Queen's. He'd just written a book called In Weakness, Strength. And he came to talk to the Queen's University medical department. And I had a friend in my Bible study group who was going to his lecture. And he was talking about how patients don't need doctors. Doctors need patients.
And that we all need to feel needed?
That's it. Exactly that. And I remember going up to him and talking to him about my late grandmother, who had a real battle with alcoholism for a long, long time, maybe her whole life, but certainly the time that I knew her. And I said, what can I do to help her? And he held my hands. I'll never forget this. And he just looked into my eyes and he said, have you told her how much you need her? And I can't even talk about that now without sort of breaking down. Mm-hmm. It was such a beautiful thing to say. And that certainly settled into my head and into my heart. And yeah, a lot of what I've read from him or learned from him in the precious conversations that I've had, I think has probably played into this amazing set of gatherings that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is required to have. And I've met some amazing people who have forgiven people of the most cruel, humiliating, abusive act that you could possibly think of, and maybe even not possibly think of.
I just want to ask you about, to cynics, they would say, well, what's the point of talking? And that seems to be, it's, not actually accomplishing anything. It's not worth anything. We should just move on and get into the future. Could you just talk about the importance of conversations generally? I mean, at a time of, the CBC is facing a lot of cutbacks, and it doesn't seem like those sort of places where we can have discussions and open up, they don't seem to be valued right now. Could you talk about the importance of having these conversations and connecting with one another?
Well, I can relate it back to my own experience of depression. I think telling your story is very important. I also really think that as you tell it, it's out of you. It's come out of you. It's not something that you are keeping to yourself.
Before we acknowledge it, it has this power over us.
That's right. That's right. And the other thing is, if it is something that is a burden, once you have it out of you, it can be shared by other people. I'm speaking very specifically right now of the statements, the testimony that residential school survivors are given. I think it's so important. Many, many survivors have said how light they feel after they've been able to tell their story for the first time. Mm-hmm. I really think when we talk about carrying a burden, that there is a physical impact to keeping this inside ourselves, keeping these dark stories inside ourselves. And I've seen it time and time again, that when the story is out and when the truth is shared and known, there's a lessening of this burden. And I see this as a sort of, this is something that I think Canada has to participate in, or else Canada is not going to be the country that it thinks it is.
I mean, there's that, the Parliament is starting a committee looking at revisiting our history, but it seems to be looking at it instead of more in terms of our relationships with the Aboriginals and the people who are already here. It's looking at it in terms of the wars and the conquest.
Well, I wish that we would really explore the relationship with the people who were here first, because that is the beginning of our history. First contact is the beginning. It's where non-Aboriginals start on this land. And I do wish that we weren't marking history in that traditional sense of dates and battles and wars. History is really the stuff in between all of that. Those are the big events, but history is our collective story. And I think that we should be looking at our history from a completely different point of view. But that's just my tiny voice here. I don't know how to affect that change, Kevin, except by doing what I'm doing and learning the history, and in this case, firsthand from the survivors, and trying to educate myself, because I didn't learn this in school, and maybe we won't be learning it in school. However, I'm very heartened and encouraged by the fact that the North now has in its curriculum for high school students a section on the residential school period in Canada. Mm-hmm. And that this is starting in other provinces as well. So, education is still a provincial jurisdiction, and I'm hoping that the provinces will really come to the table and make sure that young Canadians taking history now understand the real story, because it's playing out in all sorts of ways. Unsettled land claims.
Yeah.
I think when pipelines start to be laid down, we're going to see something else again. And I think if we don't understand why that land is important, we're not going to get to the heart of our relationship and what broke it.
Well, to end off, before you were saying how important it is, the shows like Morningside, connecting Canadians, giving us a sense of a place to share our stories and have conversations and sort of realize how much more in common we share than what divides us. So, things like the CBC and having these forums. Could you just talk about how important your sense of the CBC is to these national conversations, and why it's important that we have these venues? I
love, in its simplest form, the CBC mandate is to reflect Canada to Canadians. And I think that's poetic. I think as a country, we're so spread out. What are our chances of really getting to know each other if we don't have national conversations, if we don't hear from all parts of the country? I think as I was going across Canada during the lockout in 2005, I was with a couple of my crew members, and one producer in particular. We drove from Victoria to St. John's over the course of the lockout, which was 8 or 9 weeks. And we held ad hoc public forums about public broadcasting. But people in Moose Jaw said they wanted to know about what was going on in Toronto and Iqaluit. And that happened time and time again. We want to know about each other. And I think that's just a basic human instinct. We're curious about each other. We're curious about other human beings. And I think as things become more global, I think having a place where we can talk to each other as Canadians is even more important than it ever was. And it's not to say, I want some sort of parochial program. I don't. But I think we're facing a lot of challenges, and airing them is very, very important. Mm-hmm. And I don't know who else is going to do it but the CBC in the way that we will do it.
Well, your show is called Sounds Like Canada for those years, and to me and many other Canadians, you do sound like Canada, and so thanks so much for what you do. To many Canadians, you're one of those people that bring us together.
I am the Canadian Imodium. Well, thanks, Kevin. Honestly, great to talk to you. I really appreciate it, and it's very different for me to be on the other side of the microphone.
Yeah.
So I appreciate this. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Shelagh Rogers. I reached her by phone at her home on Gabriola Island in BC. Well, that's all the time we have this week for Broadcasting Canada. To find out more about the series, you can visit us online at broadcastingcanada.com. And there you can check out our other interviews with CBC hosts from Michael Enright and Carol Off to Peter Mansbridge and Jian Ghomeshi. Broadcasting Canada was put together by myself, Kevin Caners, along with Sharon Riley, Ken Stour, Eric Betlam, Sean Rasmussen, J.P. Davidson, Joseph Novak, Brian Colley, and Courtney Clinton. And final word, what is it like to be a Canadian broadcaster?
I am the Canadian Imodium.
See you next time on Broadcasting Canada.